That was today's journey into the forgotten past. If you enjoyed uncovering the secrets of Hollow Fort, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what comes next. There are plenty more hidden places and untold stories waiting to be explored. Check out the next video right here on the channel. And if you felt the same eerie curiosity I did, share this video with someone who loves a good mystery. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next adventure. The road wound like a tired serpent through the northeastern hills of Pennsylvania, climbing into a region that seemed forgotten by the passing decades. It was the end of autumn, the kind that lingered too long, the air sharpened to a metallic edge, the sky a slow bruise of fading light. The trees along the slopes had shed most of their leaves, and the remaining few clung to the branches like thoughts one can't let go of. Here, electricity lines buzzed faintly in the damp wind, and old stone walls, crumbling and green with moss, stood like broken sentences across the landscape. There were few houses, and those that still stood were far apart, silent, their roofs slanted like bowed heads. Travelers rarely came this way anymore, not since the main highway had been rerouted 2 towns south. Beyond the turnoff that no map acknowledged lay a trail overgrown with weeds and half swallowed by the forest. It led toward what the old county surveyor had once marked as Marlowe's Hold, a forgotten estate whose history had slipped from documents into folklore. Local farmers, when asked, would shrug and say that Hollow Fort, the name it had gained later, was cursed ground, a place where the earth itself moaned at night. Some claimed they had heard it during storms, a low, resonant hum that moved beneath the hills, as if the bedrock itself were restless. Cows would startle and run toward the ridge. Dogs would howl at the ground rather than the sky. There were stories of a nobleman, an Englishman named Jonathan Marlowe, who had built himself a fortress here in the 1770s, when the colonies were whispering rebellion and fear walked beside rumor. According to the stories, Marlowe had been a strange man, half visionary and half mad, who mistrusted both men and heaven. When his peers warned him that paranoia would consume his mind, he withdrew to the wilderness and built a house that was also a stronghold. He used local laborers, farmers, quarrymen, even vagrants who vanished after the work was done, and supervised every stone that went into his creation. They said he never slept during the final year of construction. At night he would wander the site with a lantern, talking to the ground, listening for something no one else could hear. The masons swore he paid them double wages to finish the lower chambers quickly, and when they had done so, he sealed them himself. In 1778, during the peak of his obsession, Marlowe vanished. Some said he was killed by raiders. Others believed he had gone mad and locked himself underground. When the estate was opened decades later, they found his journal scattered in pieces, filled with incoherent lines and Latin phrases about sleeping sentinels, guardians of the hollow, and the silence beneath the heart. The manor fell into decay, its lands reclaimed by forest. Only the legend remained, told in the same dry tone as weather reports, as if the locals feared to color it with emotion. Hollow Fort became a word for something unsettling but ordinary, the way people speak of a fever that never quite kills. It was this legend that first drew Ethan Carver north. For years he had lived with ghosts of his own, though not the kind that walked. He had been an architect once, specializing in restoration, the kind of man who believed that preserving the past was a moral duty. His career had ended abruptly after a project in Boston collapsed a 19th-century warehouse turned luxury lofts. The failure had killed 2 workers. The investigation cleared him of legal fault, but public blame clung to him like soot. Since then, Ethan had lived quietly, renting a cabin near the Allegheny State Forest, working on small academic grants, writing obscure essays about forgotten buildings and the psychology of stone. His notebooks were filled with half-drawn plans and quotations from old survey maps. He rarely spoke to anyone, but he listened to the creak of timbers, to the breath of structures that had survived centuries. When he came across the mention of Hollow Fort in a digitized archive of colonial architecture, he had nearly dismissed it. The file was miscatalogued, a folded piece of parchment scanned between unrelated blueprints. Yet something about it stopped him. There was a crude sketch, a rectangular building marked Main Hall, surrounded by lines that spiraled downward. The notation read, 3 galleries below, each smaller than the last. Second passage to the eastern cliff. That second passage was the hook that caught him. No other estate of that period had documented underground systems of such complexity, and yet no geological record mentioned any caverns beneath the site. Marlowe's paranoia, perhaps, but the pattern of tunnels seemed deliberate, mathematically precise. Ethan printed the document, pinned it to his wall, and found himself returning to it night after night. He could trace the anxiety in Marlowe's hand, the insistence of his geometry. What was the man trying to contain or reach? Soon the curiosity became a private obsession. He told himself it was research, redemption even. To map and document Hollow Fort would be to give shape to something the world had neglected. It would also, in some buried part of him, restore a faith he had lost, that architecture could still speak honestly about human fear and hope. He began to prepare the journey as though for an expedition. His tools were simple: a compass, a field notebook, a small digital camera, chalk for marking walls, a flashlight, a climbing rope, gloves, and a respirator mask remnants from his old job. He also packed a topographic map from the Geological Survey and a printed list of local coordinates. The site, as far as he could tell, lay on private land, but no recent ownership was recorded. The last deed had expired in 1902. He left before dawn. The sky was leaden, the mist low enough to graze the treetops. He drove north for hours until the paved road gave way to gravel, then to mud. The further he went, the more the world seemed to dissolve into shadow and fog. Cell service dropped out. The GPS stuttered and froze. He switched to the compass, watching its needle quiver as if uncertain. The forest thickened, hemming the path on both sides. Fallen trees blocked part of the trail, forcing him to park and continue on foot. The silence deepened. Even the birds were absent, as though the air itself were holding its breath. He moved carefully, following the faint rise of land toward where the old survey map placed the estate. Here the ground was uneven, pocked with shallow depressions and ringed by roots. He noticed fragments of masonry buried under moss stones with lime residue, perhaps remnants of an outer wall. Every few steps, he marked his direction with chalk on the nearest trunk. The slope grew steeper until at last he came to what might once have been a drive. Two parallel lines of sunken earth, leading upward between overgrown hedges. The first sign of the place was not the house itself, but a weathered pillar of granite half buried in soil. It bore no inscription, only a shallow groove at its top where an iron gate might have rested. Beside it lay the rusted remains of hinges, and a few feet beyond, a twisted iron bar still anchored in stone. He followed the line of the vanished fence until it opened suddenly into a clearing, and there, half veiled by the drifting mist, stood Hollow Fort. At first glance, it was less a house than a scar in the landscape. The main structure rose 3 stories. Its slate roof caved in on one wing. The windows gaped blackly, some shuttered, others empty. Vines crawled up the walls, their tendrils gripping the mortar like claws. The facade bore traces of ornament-carved keystones, worn faces of cherubs now eroded to blanks. At each corner stood a short bastion, a remnant of Marlowe's defensive fantasies. The air smelled of cold stone and damp earth. Ethan stopped and took a long breath, feeling both awe and the faint tremor of unease. He walked around the perimeter, sketching as he went. The ground near the foundation sloped sharply, suggesting the hidden basements beneath. Several narrow openings punctuated the lower walls, too small for windows. He knelt and examined one, noting the metal grill set deep within. It looked more like a vent than a weapon slit. The craftsmanship was precise, almost scientific. This was no random eccentric's folly. It was the work of a mind methodical, perhaps frightened, but brilliant. He circled the back of the house, where a terrace had once overlooked the valley. Here the stone balustrade had collapsed, its fragments scattered down the slope. A single tree, immense and ancient, stood nearby. Its roots coiled through the remnants of the terrace like the fingers of something buried trying to reclaim its surface. The wind stirred the branches, and for a moment Ethan thought he heard a murmur, a vibration deep in the trunk, as though the tree itself were listening. He forced himself to focus on practical details, the condition of the stone, the direction of the cracks, the angle of settlement. Yet the longer he stood there, the more he felt an invisible pressure in the air, a pulse underfoot that followed no rhythm he recognized. It was not the distant roll of thunder. There were no clouds thick enough for that. It was subtler, steadier, as if the earth beneath Hollow Fort was breathing slowly in and out. Dusk began to gather, and the color of the forest sank toward gray. Ethan marked his final note for the day. Perimeter intact. Structural failure localized to south wing. Ventilation system anomalous. Will enter at first light. He turned toward the main door, heavy oak planks swollen by time, and rested his hand on the iron latch. For an instant he imagined the weight of centuries pressing through the metal, the cold memory of the man who had once locked it against the world. He did not yet open it. Instead, he stood in the threshold's shadow, listening. The forest behind him whispered, and somewhere deep inside the house, a faint sound echoed. So faint it might have been imagination, a sigh, or a low hum rising from the stones. It lasted only a moment, then faded into the quiet. He stepped back and looked up at the facade again. The upper windows caught the last gleam of the dying light. For a heartbeat, he could have sworn one of them reflected movement, something shifting just beyond sight. Then the light vanished, and the house returned to its stillness. Ethan set up his small tent near the gate and lit a single lamp. The mist thickened around the clearing until the fort became little more than a darker shape in the fog. He ate without appetite, jotting a few thoughts in his notebook. The words came slowly. Structure exhibits breathing resonance, possible venting from subchambers. Not wind, possible subsidence cavities. Then below that, almost without thinking, he wrote, "The legend might have begun with a sound. As the night deepened, the noise of the forest returned in fragments, an owl's distant call, the faint drip of moisture from branches. Yet beneath these, almost beyond hearing, was a subtle vibration, like the aftertone of a bell struck deep underground. It rose, fell, and then rose again, merging with the rhythm of his own pulse. He closed the notebook and lay down, eyes open, staring into the dark. He thought of Marlowe, the architect of fear, pacing his corridors with a lantern 2 centuries ago. He thought of the drawings, the circles within circles, the Latin words that spoke of sleeping sentinels. He wondered what it meant to build something not for shelter or beauty, but to hold back what should not be released. And as he drifted toward uneasy sleep, he knew with the certainty of a man stepping into another man's dream that he would open those doors tomorrow. That thought stayed with him as the night wore on, and when the faint pre-dawn light began to touch the edges of the fog, he awoke with the feeling that he had heard a voice calling, not aloud, but through the vibration of the ground. It spoke in no language he knew, yet its meaning was clear enough. It was an invitation. When morning came, the mist still clung to the hills like old smoke, thin but unwilling to leave. The trees stood quiet and rhymed with dew. Ethan woke with a stiffness that belonged more to the place than to his body, as if the cold had seeped into him through the soil. For a moment, lying in his tent, he thought he could still hear that faint subterranean pulse, the low hum that had rocked the ground through the night. But when he opened the flap and stepped into the gray light, there was nothing, only the slow dripping of water from the branches above and the call of a lone crow somewhere beyond the ridge. Hollow Fort loomed ahead of him, its dark mass more defined now, the edges sharp and unforgiving in daylight. He packed his things methodically, slid his notebook into the side pocket of his pack, and checked his equipment. The air smelled of iron and wet leaves, the scent of slow decay. As he approached the house, he could see the fine fractures in the stonework, the lichens spreading like pale veins across the walls. Time had peeled the color from the shutters. The remaining paint flaked in soft curls, revealing layers of gray wood underneath. The main door stood closed, its iron handle furred with rust, but still somehow, the whole structure seemed to breathe. There was a faint draft that moved through the cracks, the sigh of air exhaled and drawn again. He placed a hand on the surface of the door and pushed. It yielded reluctantly, the hinges groaning in protest. The sound rolled through the interior like a long, tired yawn. Dust swirled in the slant of light that spilled across the threshold. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, the smell of dry plaster and rot washing over him. Then he stepped inside. The entrance hall was vast, a space that might once have been grand, but now lay hollow, stripped of all color and meaning. The ceiling arched high above, still bearing faint traces of ornament moldings and plaster roses, though most had fallen. The floorboards were broad, worn smooth by footsteps long vanished. He could see where rugs or furniture had once stood, pale rectangular ghosts imprinted in the dust. The air was heavy, filled with a strange tension, like the pause before thunder. He could feel it on his skin, a slight electric prickle that made his scalp tighten. He began his methodical inspection, walking slowly along the walls, tracing the joints of the masonry, noting irregularities. The architecture was unusual, part colonial, part fortress. The outer walls were thick, much thicker than they needed to be for a mere house, and the lower portions showed seams that hinted at later additions, reinforcing what the map had already suggested, that Marlowe's structure was built downward as much as upward. Ethan crouched to examine the vents along the baseboard's narrow slits covered with iron grills, so evenly spaced that they formed a pattern. He drew them into his notebook, marking each one, counting the rhythm between them. The alignment was too precise for mere ventilation. It was more like a system of respiration, the mechanical lungs of the house. As he moved deeper, he entered a wide corridor that stretched along the length of the building. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the varnish long dulled to the color of ash. At the far end stood a staircase, wide and shallow, curving upward to the second floor. He could see light filtering through broken shutters above, casting stripes across the landing. To his right, a doorway opened into what must have been the drawing room. The moment he crossed the threshold, a sudden shift in temperature brushed against him. The air here was cooler, fresher, as if drawn from an unseen source below. He paused, listening. A faint sound echoed from somewhere in the depths. Perhaps wind moving through an open flue. Yet there was no real breeze outside. The sound rose and fell, rhythmic, persistent, until he realized it matched the sensation underfoot, the steady pulse he had felt in the soil the night before. He knelt and placed his palm on the floorboards. The vibration was subtle, but it was there, as though the foundation itself had a heartbeat. He withdrew his hand quickly, unsettled by the intimacy of the contact. The drawing room retained traces of its former elegance. A fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel still intact. The bricks inside were blackened, though not by any recent flame. Ash mixed with fine white dust, forming strange patterns like frost on glass. On the mantel rested a small clay cup, encrusted with salt crystals, as if someone had once filled it with seawater and left it to evaporate. Beside it lay a thin line of salt, deliberately drawn, perfectly straight. Ethan leaned closer, frowning. Salt was a common preservative in older homes, but this placement around a hearth was peculiar. He turned and scanned the room. Shelves lined the far wall, some still holding tattered books whose spines had split. Dust lay thick, but beneath it he noticed an odd detail. Circular marks, faint impressions as though heavy objects had once stood there and been carefully removed. The dust had settled afterward, leaving behind only their ghosts. Someone or something had disturbed this room far more recently than a century ago. Crossing back to the hall, he tested the main staircase. The wood creaked but held. The rise of each step was shallow, designed for a man who wished to move quietly. Halfway up he paused, catching sight of a framed shape on the wall, a darker rectangle where a painting had once hung. He could almost see it there, a portrait perhaps. Marlowe's own face staring down with the unblinking authority of stone. But the frame was gone, leaving behind only its silhouette, a void in the dust. Upstairs, the light grew stronger, filtering through a fractured window pane. The corridor branched into a series of rooms. Each was empty, save for fragments of furniture. In one, a toppled writing desk lay on its side, drawers pulled out, papers scattered like dried leaves. Most were too decayed to read, but a few still held faint ink traces. He picked one up carefully, recognizing the archaic slant of 18th century handwriting. The words were mostly in Latin, interspersed with English phrases. Custos must not waver. The second circle holds if the salt remains pure. Another line read, for that which sleeps beneath must not be awakened. Ethan's pulse quickened. He took a photograph and slid the fragment into a protective sleeve. In the next room, which might have served as a study, a large table stood beneath a broken window. On its surface, he found what remained of a map drawn in graphite. The layout was roughly similar to the sketch from the archive. Concentric lines, 3 levels, in the same notation, to the eastern cliff. Along one margin, there was an additional note in a different hand. Watch for the breathing walls. The phrase sent a shiver through him. By the time he descended again, the afternoon light had dimmed. He returned to the ground floor, entering what appeared to be a smaller library. Here the shelves were better preserved, the books dry and intact. The air smelled faintly of mildew and wax. A massive piano stood in the corner, its lid warped and keys yellowed. When he brushed one with his glove, a dull, ghostly note sounded. The vibration lingered far longer than it should have, humming through the wood as if the sound had sunk into the structure itself. He moved away quickly, unnerved by the sense that the house was echoing his every gesture. He began searching for the entrance to the lower level, remembering the mention of underground galleries. Most large estates of that era had cellars for storage or servants' quarters, but Marlowe's plans hinted at something far deeper. Ethan methodically checked every room, tapping along the walls, listening for hollowness. It was in the dining hall that he found a clue, a section of paneling behind a built-in cupboard where the wood sounded oddly muted. He ran his hand along the seam and felt a faint draft. When he pressed harder, a panel shifted with a reluctant sigh. Behind it lay a brick wall, newer than the surrounding structure. He examined the mortar closely. It was uneven, applied hastily. Someone had sealed this entrance long after the rest of the house was built. Reaching into his pack, he took out a small hammer and began to chip away at the edge. The bricks crumbled easily, revealing a narrow opening beyond, black as pitch. The air that flowed out was cool and damp, smelling faintly of minerals. He switched on his flashlight. The beam cut a swath through the darkness, glinting off what appeared to be rough-hewn stone steps descending into the ground. Before proceeding, he prepared carefully. He tied one end of his rope to the sturdy stair railing in the hall, checked the grip, and looped the other around his waist. He marked a white chalk arrow beside the entrance, his own breadcrumb for the way back. The discipline of procedure calmed him. The old habits of fieldwork replaced the faint dread rising in his chest. When he finally stepped through the gap, the air changed at once. The temperature dropped, and the sound of his own breathing became amplified, as if the walls themselves were listening. The descent was steep. Moisture glistened on the stone, dripping slowly from the ceiling. The walls bore tool marks, chisels, picks, evidence of manual excavation. But the geometry was odd. Every few feet, the tunnel angled slightly, forming a subtle spiral. The texture of the walls changed too, from cut stone to plaster, embedded with what looked like fragments of shell. He touched one. It was smooth and white, almost fossilized. The deeper he went, the stronger the mineral scent became, mixed now with something else, something metallic, like blood or rust. He paused to take a measurement, counting his steps, estimating the incline. The depth, by his reckoning, was already 20 feet below the surface. The tunnel widened slightly, forming a small chamber. Here, symbols covered the walls, crude carvings of intersecting lines, circles, and the letter phi repeated again and again. Between them, words were scratched in charcoal Latin phrases, short and abrupt: dormientes, vigilia, serva circulum. A few were barely legible, the letters smeared by moisture. On the ground lay a thin layer of salt, as if poured intentionally. The air seemed to vibrate. It was not sound exactly, but sensation, a trembling in the bones. He steadied the flashlight, sweeping it across the chamber. At the far side, half buried in debris, something metallic caught the light. He knelt, brushed away the loose soil, and uncovered an object shaped roughly like a mask. It was heavy, iron or bronze, corroded by centuries. The face was stylized, the features elongated, with narrow eye slits and a closed mouth. Around the edge ran an inscription: Quod dormis servabis. What you sleep upon, you must guard. Ethan stared at it for a long time. The message was strange, almost circular in its logic. Guard what you let sleep. Protect the very thing you fear to wake. He felt the pulse again beneath his feet, stronger now, and for a moment he imagined he could feel it resonating through the metal in his hands. The mask was cold, but it seemed to hum faintly, as though remembering. He forced himself to focus. He documented everything carefully: photographs, notes, sketches of the carvings, precise measurements of the tunnel's width and slope. He knew the importance of method. It kept chaos at bay. Yet he couldn't ignore the thought that this place had not been meant for discovery. It was built as a seal, not as a shelter. The salt, the carvings, the strange acoustics, they spoke of a purpose beyond defense. The vibration grew steady, no longer an occasional tremor, but a continuous throb, like a vast, slow breath drawn and released. It filled the space without sound, pressing against his chest. He shone the light deeper into the passage ahead, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness, as if the air itself were solid. A whisper of rational thought told him that what he felt was simply geology, the resonance of water in deep stone cavities, the slow settling of rock. But another part of him, older and instinctive, knew it was something else. He backed away slowly, marking another arrow on the wall, each stroke of chalk deliberate. The mask he left where he had found it. As he climbed back toward the faint glow from the house, the hum followed him, fading only when he stepped through the broken wall into the hall again. He turned and sealed the gap with the cupboard as best he could. The moment the opening closed, the sound ceased entirely, leaving a silence so sudden it seemed to ring in his ears. He stood there, breathing hard, feeling the sweat cool on his skin. The house was quiet, the air heavy and unmoving. Yet something had changed. The silence was not empty. It felt attentive, alert. He looked toward the staircase, half expecting to see a shadow there, but the landing was empty. He told himself that the vibrations were natural, that the salt and symbols were eccentric remnants of a frightened man's obsession. But when he turned to the fireplace, he saw that the line of salt on the mantel was no longer straight. It curved now, subtly as though drawn by an unseen hand in the dust. He stared at it for a long time, his pulse matching the slow rhythm of the breath he had felt below. Then he set his lamp on the floor, opened his notebook, and wrote, with hands that trembled slightly, "Substructure located, evidence of deliberate sealing. Purpose unclear. Possible acoustic phenomenon, yet house appears to exhale." He stopped writing. From somewhere deep beneath him, faint and far, the hum began again. It was slower this time, heavier, like a sigh from the depths of the earth. He listened, unable to tell whether it was welcome or warning. Then he closed the notebook, extinguished the lamp, and let the darkness return, knowing that when he descended again, he would not be alone with silence. The following morning arrived without dawn. The sky hung low and colorless, and the air felt thick, like water waiting to turn to ice. Ethan awoke on the cold floor of the hall, where he must have fallen asleep against the wall some time after midnight. His lamp had burned out, leaving only a faint gray light seeping through the broken window panes. For a moment he couldn't tell if he was still dreaming. The silence was too complete, dense, almost tangible, and the memory of the humming below clung to him like a half-heard echo. He rose slowly, stretching his sore limbs. Every joint ached, and there was a metallic taste in his mouth. His notebook lay open beside him, the last entry blurred by moisture. He turned a few pages and saw his own handwriting twist into illegibility, as though the ink had bled outward overnight. It was possible he had left it too close to the damp air seeping through the wall, but part of him felt that the distortion wasn't entirely natural. The pages pulsed faintly when the light hit them, like the memory of vibration trapped in paper fibers. He stepped outside to clear his head. The fog had lifted slightly, but the landscape remained pale and subdued, the world seeming to retreat behind a thin veil. The trees surrounding the clearing stood unmoving. No birds called, no insects stirred. Even the wind seemed reluctant to touch the house. It was as though nature itself was holding its breath, waiting. Hollow Fort looked different in this strange, half-lightless ruin somehow. The edges of the stone were sharper, the lines of the roof more defined. For a fleeting moment, he could almost imagine it whole again, restored to its original form. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, the illusion faded, and the decay returned. He forced himself to eat something. though every bite turned to dust on his tongue. The morning felt endless, and yet he dreaded what it would bring. He had promised himself the night before that he would not descend again, not until he had confirmed his findings with geological data or brought someone else to verify the tunnels. But as he stood there, looking at the heavy oak door, he knew that promise was already broken. Something down there had not finished speaking. The pulse had stopped only when he sealed the entrance, and part of him was haunted by the thought that perhaps it had stopped because it was listening. He returned inside. The air was colder now, though there was no sign of wind. The dust he had disturbed yesterday had not resettled. Instead, faint tracks crossed the floor patterns of disturbed powder that did not match his own footprints. They began near the sealed cupboard, curved across the room, and disappeared beneath the stairs. The marks were too shallow for shoe prints, more like a ripple left by something dragging itself slowly across the surface. Ethan knelt, studying them closely. They led toward the central hall, where the main staircase curved upward. There, directly beneath the first landing, he saw it. A faint gap in the paneling, the outline of another door he hadn't noticed before. The door was smaller than the others, built flush into the wall, with no visible handle, just a rusted ring half hidden in shadow. He pulled it, and a gust of air rushed past him, as if the house had been waiting for him to open it. The smell that emerged was unmistakable. Damp stone and something older, something like iron long buried. A narrow passage extended behind the door, descending at a shallow angle into darkness. It wasn't the same entrance he had found yesterday. This one was older, smoother, carved directly into the foundation. The air that flowed from it was steady and rhythmic, faintly warm, as though exhaled from some deep chamber below. Ethan hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. His flashlight cut through the dark, revealing walls slick with condensation. The passage was narrower than the previous one, the ceiling low enough that he had to crouch. It twisted gradually downward, turning once, twice, until he lost all sense of direction. The air thickened, and the sound of his own breathing echoed back in the strange counterpoint, delayed and distorted, as though the tunnel were breathing with him. His heartbeat began to synchronize with that echo until he could no longer tell which was which. The corridor opened at last into a wide circular chamber. The walls were carved with symbols more intricate than those above, spirals within spirals, intersecting at impossible angles. At the center of the floor lay a shallow depression filled with water, perfectly still. Around it were scattered remnants of objects, small metal tools, fragments of pottery, and what looked like the corner of a shattered stone tablet. The air shimmered faintly above the pool, and the vibration was stronger here, a deep, slow thrum that resonated in his chest. He realized that he was standing at the heart of whatever mechanism or organism the entire fortress had been built around. He took a cautious step forward and knelt beside the pool. The surface was clear but strangely dense, reflecting his face with unnatural sharpness. Beneath the reflection, shapes moved, not distortions, but forms, shifting in slow patterns like ink suspended in oil. For a moment he thought they were shadows cast by his flashlight, but when he turned the beam away, they continued to move. He leaned closer, breath fogging the surface. The hum deepened, as though acknowledging his presence. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Marlowe, what did you build here?" The answer came not in sound but in motion. The water rippled outward in perfect concentric circles, then stilled again. A faint whisper brushed his ear, not words, but a vibration that formed meaning without language. It was both invitation and warning, the echo of something vast and ancient. He staggered back, gripping his flashlight tighter. The carvings on the wall seemed to twist as the beam passed over them, forming patterns that resembled faces, elongated, eyeless, mouths open in silent breath. He tried to steady himself by focusing on reason. It was geological, he told himself. Pockets of air trapped in subterranean reservoirs, vibrations amplified by the structure's design. But no structure, no matter how old, could explain the sensation of being observed. The walls pulsed subtly, the air expanding and contracting in unison. It was breathing slow, measured, endless. He felt it pressing against his eardrums, whispering against his bones. The phrase from the manuscript returned to him. The second circle holds if the salt remains pure. He turned his light to the floor and saw, at the edge of the pool, a thin white line of salt that formed a broken ring. A gap, no wider than a coin, interrupted the circle. Something cold tightened in his chest. He understood, too late, that Marlowe hadn't sealed these tunnels to protect himself. The fortress wasn't a refuge, it was a lock. The salt, the geometry, the spirals, they were mechanisms of containment. And now, by disturbing them, he had opened the way for the thing inside to breathe freely again. The vibration intensified, becoming a low roar that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The pool darkened, the surface clouding like smoke trapped under glass. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. The light wavered, flickered, then steadied again. But the water had changed. It no longer reflected him. Instead, he saw the faint outline of a vast shape below, something that seemed both solid and fluid, its contours indistinct but immense. It stirred once, as though in slow awakening, and the air trembled violently. He turned and ran, following the tunnel's curve upward, the sound of his own footsteps drowned by the mounting hum. The air grew hotter, pressing against his lungs. When he reached the narrow door, he slammed it shut behind him and leaned against it, gasping. For a long moment, he heard nothing. Then faintly from below came a single, deep exhalation that made the floorboards tremble. The sound faded, leaving behind silence but not stillness. He could feel the rhythm continuing, muted now, hidden under layers of stone. The house had resumed its breathing, calm and steady, as though settling back into slumber. He didn't know how long he stood there, trembling, staring at the sealed door. Time had lost its shape. Eventually, he gathered the last of his strength and made his way upstairs. The air on the upper floor was warm now, the dust no longer motionless. Curtains swayed gently as if stirred by invisible hands. The house was alive in a way it hadn't been before. Not restless, but aware. He could sense it watching, waiting. He crossed to the window and looked outside. The forest was motionless, but in the distance he thought he saw the earth itself shift. A faint ripple passing through the soil near the ridge, like a wave moving beneath a frozen sea. He turned away, sat down at the old writing desk, and forced himself to record what he had seen. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, as though they were being dictated. The structure was never meant as shelter, he wrote. It was built as a vessel, a boundary between worlds. The vibration is the breath of what sleeps below. It has been contained by geometry and faith, by salt and silence. I have broken the seal. He stopped, his hand shaking. The ink blurred as it touched the page, spreading outward like veins in stone. He rose again, pacing the room. The floor beneath his feet felt different, lighter, almost hollow. He knelt and pressed his palm to the boards. The pulse was faint now, but steady. It no longer frightened him. It was almost familiar, like the rhythm of his own blood. He thought of Marlowe, wandering these same halls, haunted by the same sound. Perhaps the man had not gone mad. Perhaps he had merely listened too closely to what the earth was saying. As the hours passed, Ethan's fear began to change shape. It was no longer panic, but a strange, serene understanding. The thing beneath the house was not malevolent, not in any human sense. It was older than fear itself, a force that had been buried to keep the balance of something greater. The fortress was a lung for the world, drawing in the silence of the earth, exhaling time. Marlowe had built it to contain the breath of creation itself, to keep it sleeping. And now Ethan had felt it stir. The hum was slowing again, returning to the deep rhythm of slumber, but it would never be fully still. As night descended, he lit a single candle. The house seemed to breathe in unison with the flicker of the flame, expanding and contracting with each pulse of light. He thought of leaving, but the idea no longer made sense. Where could he go that was beyond the reach of this? The sound beneath the ground was everywhere now, faint but eternal, like the ocean's heartbeat. He realized with quiet certainty that he was part of it now. The house had accepted him as it once accepted Marlowe. The structure would continue to breathe through him, its new custodian. Outside, the fog thickened once more. swallowing the clearing. From a distance, Hollow Fort was invisible again, hidden beneath layers of silence and myth. Inside, Ethan sat at the desk, still writing long after the candle had burned to its base. His last line was barely legible, scratched into the paper with the tip of the pen. The sleeper remains, but the circle is open. The fortress breathes through me now. Then the candle went out. The darkness filled the room completely, and in the depths below, the hum rose once more. Slow, steady, patient, as the house exhaled into eternity. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next exploration. Check out my other videos for more forgotten places and hidden histories. And if this one gave you chills, share it with a friend who loves mysteries too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.